Jack Thompson breaks his silence, a living monument to Australian cinema. It wasn't the rustle of the eucalyptus trees or the hush of a film set that brought the world to a standstill. It was the voice of a man who had been silent for 84 years. Jack Thompson, Australia's lion-hearted leading man, finally broke his silence, not with a roar, but with a voice weathered by time, illness, and unimaginable experience. It was as if the outback itself had leaned in to listen, as if the land remembered every footstep he had ever taken on screen and off. The man who had once stared down injustice in Breaker Morant and wore the soul of the nation on his weather-beaten face in The Man from Snowy River now stood not in character, but as himself, older, frailer, but more profound than ever. He began, not with anecdotes of fame or glittering premieres, but with a memory. A dusty morning, a forgotten town, a boy with dirt on his knees and stars in his eyes. "Before the lights," he murmured, "I was just a kid, trying to understand silence." And now, decades later, that same boy speaks again. But this time with the gravity of a legacy that shaped not just Australian film, but Australian identity. Jack Thompson is not just an actor. He is an embodiment of our national story, equal parts grit and grace, elegance and earth. His performances were never just performances. They were rituals. Every line he delivered felt like it was carved into the sandstone cliffs of the Blue Mountains. Now, his body is betraying him, withered by ailments that have grown more persistent with each passing season. But his mind remains sharp, his spirit intact, and his voice, unused for far too long, now commands attention not with volume, but with truth. For years the public wondered why Jack had receded from view. Rumors circled. Health scares, artistic disillusionment, private loss. The truth, he reveals, is stranger still. "I had nothing left to say," he admits, "until I realized silence doesn't protect what we love. It only delays the moment we lose it." And so he speaks, slowly, deliberately, each word measured like the pace of a man crossing the desert with nothing but a memory for company. Behind closed doors, his health has taken blows that would silence lesser men. The joints that once carried him across war-torn sets now ache with every movement. The lungs that once thundered on stage now breathe shallowly, accompanied by a persistent rattle. Yet there's an unmistakable beauty in his vulnerability. It is not weakness, but weathering, not the end of the road, but the transformation of a path into a trail of meaning. Friends describe him now as a walking archive, a museum of unspoken history. Directors whisper that no modern actor can carry silence like Jack can. His very presence now feels ceremonial, like encountering the last living tree of an ancient forest. His hands tremble. Yes, but within them lies the soul of 1,000 characters, 1,000 forgotten moments, 1,000 stories that could only have been told by him. This isn't about nostalgia. It's not about looking back. It's about listening now. Because when Jack Thompson speaks, after 84 years of cinematic greatness and private pain, it's not just a man talking. It's a whole country remembering who it is. And he's not finished, not yet. The quiet years, the weight of legacy. Long before Jack Thompson became a household name, long before he etched his rugged charm into the consciousness of Australian cinema, there was a boy abandoned by the world and taken in by the sea. He never knew his birth parents. He was adopted at the age of 4 and raised by a merchant marine in Sydney. That childhood, painted in shades of grey and salt water, taught him that survival meant learning to carry silence like a shield. And for years, Jack did just that. Even as his face became iconic, he kept his true self tucked far beneath layers of performances, public adoration, and carefully rehearsed smiles. Now, at 84, with his once commanding frame slowly giving in to the passage of time, Jack lives quietly in Byron Bay. His days are slow, heavy, not just from illness, but from a solitude that feels earned and yet unjust. There are moments when the pain in his legs becomes unbearable, but he refuses to take stronger medication. "If I dull it too much," he says, "I'll forget what it feels like to be alive." That's the kind of man Jack Thompson has always been. Not dramatic, just deeply human. Yet behind his wise, often philosophical tone is a haunting loneliness. His son, Billy, now a grown man with a life of his own, visits when he can. But there's a distance between them that has never quite closed. Old friends have drifted. Some passed on. Others simply vanished into the fog of time. Fame, Jack has often said, is a tide. It rushes in, it rushes out. And if you're lucky, you're still standing when the water clears. In the 1970s and 80s, he was Australia's symbol of masculine integrity, a man's man who wore tenderness like armor. He brought the outback into our lounges, gave voice to our roughest poetry, and stood for a kind of dignity that seemed to be vanishing. Yet, in private, Jack battled with something quieter, more insidious. The fear that all he had built was merely a reflection, not a legacy. One mysterious chapter, never fully explained, continues to surface in hushed tones. In the early 1990s, just as Hollywood beckoned and international fame seemed inevitable, Jack suddenly turned down several high-profile roles, including one alongside Meryl Streep. Why? He never gave a reason. He simply disappeared from the public eye for over a year, retreating to the Northern Territory. Some claimed he had a breakdown. Others whispered about a tragic loss no one dared to name. When asked now, he only says, "There was someone I couldn't save, and I had to live with that." This sense of unresolved grief hangs around him like mist. Not overt, but ever present. It colors his silence, shapes his glances, and gives weight to his every pause. Even as he tells his stories today, there are gaps, deliberate omissions. Moments he skips over with a half-smile and a quiet sip of tea. There is a sadness in his eyes, but not bitterness. It's a sadness that has made peace with itself, that no longer fights the past, but allows it to breathe beside him. His health, meanwhile, is a ticking clock. Arthritis has ravaged his hands, those same hands that once caressed the brim of an Akubra hat or cradled a lover's cheek on screen. He has trouble standing for long, and the simple act of climbing stairs feels like a battle. His voice, once booming and confident, now trembles with age, but in that trembling lies an unexpected power. Every word he speaks is precious, deliberate, considered, and that makes them unforgettable. He reads poetry now, writes occasionally, speaks to the kookaburras that land near his veranda. He once said, "If I had known growing old would be this lonely, I might have learned to dance more when I was young." But he smiles when he says it. There is humor still. There is grace. One wall of his home is covered in photographs, not of red carpets or film sets, but of landscapes. Desert plains, riverbanks, gum trees. Places that remind him of who he was before the world told him who he should be. He often speaks of his mother, not the one who birthed him, but the one who raised him with strict kindness. She never said, "I love you," but she made me porridge every morning, rain or shine. That was her love. There's one photograph that's always slightly askew. Visitors ask about it, but he never answers. It's an old black-and-white shot of a young woman standing beside a dusty ute. Her face is half turned away, wind in her hair. No one knows who she is. Some think she was the one who changed everything. Some believe she never existed at all. Jack doesn't correct them. He simply smiles. The journey etched in dust and celluloid. There's something unmistakably Australian about the way Jack Thompson first stumbled into acting, as if the red earth itself nudged him forward. He didn't arrive on screen with a polished pedigree or the airs of Shakespearean theatre. No, Jack's beginnings were much humbler and far more grounded. Before the spotlights, he was a jack of all trades, literally. Carpenter, bouncer, laborer. He once drove a cattle truck across Queensland, reading poetry at rest stops and reciting Shakespeare to the wind. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing something quieter. Purpose, maybe. Belonging. His first real taste of acting came through radio, back in the early 60s, when his voice, a rich, honeyed baritone, caught the attention of an ABC producer. "You sound like someone who's seen more than you say," the producer told him. And that was it. One small part led to another, and soon Jack was slipping between characters like second skins. His first television roles were modest, bit parts in Aussie dramas like Homicide and Matlock Police. But even then, there was a presence in his eyes, a depth that couldn't be taught. By the time Sunday Too Far Away, 1975, hit cinemas, Jack was no longer just a promising actor. He was the face of the new Australian cinema. That film didn't just put him on the map, it redefined the map. He played Foley, the shearer who embodied the working-class struggle and masculine stoicism of the Aussie outback. Jack didn't portray the role, he was the role. It was a performance forged in dust, sweat, and something more profound, an understanding of what it meant to be a man who never quite belonged, yet carried himself as if he did. His accolades came swiftly after. The AFI Award for Best Actor in Breaker Morant, 1980, cemented his status not just as a national treasure, but as an actor of international weight. The role of Major J.F. Thomas, a humble country lawyer standing against British injustice, was a mirror to Jack himself. Principled, quietly fierce, and deeply loyal to the truth. Hollywood noticed. Scripts poured in. But Jack didn't run toward the glamour. He chose roles carefully, often returning home between projects to walk the beaches of Byron or disappear into the bush. He had the world at his feet, but he was never fully comfortable in its spotlight. The suits, the handshakes, the photo ops, they didn't feed him. What did were the stories, especially the ones with dirt under their nails and secrets tucked behind their silence. He turned down roles most actors would kill for simply because they didn't feel honest. That was Jack's compass. Integrity over indulgence, always. But the journey wasn't all accolades and applause. There were brutal years, especially after the international press turned a cynical eye on his unconventional lifestyle. His polyamorous relationship in the 1970s, an arrangement with two sisters that defied societal norms, became tabloid fodder. Jack never defended it, nor did he apologize. "We loved each other. That should have been enough," he once said quietly. It wasn't the public judgment that hurt him, though. It was the slow erosion of private trust. The whispers, the doors that quietly closed. Roles dried up for a time, and producers grew wary. He turned inward, as he often did. He wrote. He retreated to nature. He waited. It was during one of those quiet spells that he met Peter Weir, a young director with a vision and a burning script called The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith. The film would go on to become a landmark in Australian cinema, not just for its unflinching portrayal of racial injustice, but for Jack's supporting performance. Gritty, conflicted, and painfully real. It was another turning point, and it reintroduced Jack not just as a lead man, but as a storyteller. Someone who could carry entire worlds in the pause between two lines. Over the decades, there were companions who mattered deeply. Brian Brown, his longtime mate and occasional co-star, once described Jack as the soul of our cinema. The late Heath Ledger considered him a mentor. "He never told you what to do," Heath once said. "He just showed you how to live the truth on screen." Then there was Rhonda, a production assistant he met on the set of The Sum of Us, 1994. They were never officially together, but they shared years of quiet companionship, letters written in the margins of scripts, long conversations under starlit verandas. When she passed away from cancer in 2006, Jack didn't speak publicly. But he stopped writing poetry for almost a decade after. He still visits her grave once a year, leaves a copy of whatever book he's currently reading. No fanfare, just presence. The years have added weight to his bones and ghosts to his memories, but they've also carved something rare into him, a stillness that feels like wisdom, and a gentleness that lingers in every word he now speaks. There are no grand declarations, no sweeping life philosophies, just quiet truths, gathered from decades of observing, feeling, and, at last, choosing to share. Jack Thompson's life isn't one of easy peaks and valleys. It's a story of dusty roads, difficult choices, deep love, and deeper silence. And though his body may be failing him, every slow step he takes is still a step through history. A step through the very soul of Australia itself. Shadows between the frames. In Jack Thompson's house, tucked behind an overgrown bottle brush and weather-stained weatherboard walls, there is a room no one is allowed to enter. Not his cleaner, not visiting journalists, not even his son. "That's where the ghosts live," Jack says with a smirk, but his eyes darken as he says it. The room is always locked. The key, some say, he keeps on a leather cord around his neck, hidden beneath layers of flannel and history. Others claim it was lost decades ago. The mystery of that room is just one of many shadows that trail behind Jack like old film reels, unspooled but never fully watched. There's a photograph on the mantel, worn at the corners, showing a young Jack in the outback, beside a nameless Aboriginal man. It's clear the two shared something powerful, something sacred. But when asked, Jack only says, "He taught me more about this country than any textbook ever did." The man's name is never revealed. There's no date, no caption, and no one in the press has ever been able to identify him. Stories like that pepper Jack's life, like dust on his boots, always present, never fully explained. He once vanished for nearly 6 months during the filming of The Light Horseman, 1987. Production was delayed. Rumors swirled that he'd suffered a breakdown, that he'd been found in a monastery in rural Victoria, or that he had quietly attended the deathbed of someone the world never knew existed. When questioned later, Jack merely shrugged and said, "I had to go away for a bit. Some things were heavier than the script." No one pushed further. They never do. There's a name that comes up now and again in private circles: Eliza. It's not a name associated with any of his known partners, co-stars, or family. But old letters tucked into the pages of books in his library bear the name in fading ink. "You always disappear when the light gets too close," one of them reads. "I hope one day you let someone see the whole of you." No return address, no surname. Jack refuses to speak of her, but when alone, he often gazes out the window in a kind of aching silence that makes visitors shift in their seats. Even his own son, Billy, has admitted in rare interviews that Dad's life is a patchwork. "I've never seen the full picture. I'm not sure anyone has." There are years that seem to vanish from Jack's biography. Years with no credits, no sightings, no explanation. Some believe he went overseas under another name. Others think he lived among Aboriginal communities, learning languages, stories, laws of the land few white men have ever been allowed access to. He neither confirms nor denies. "What matters," he once said, "isn't what I did, but what I carried." Among the most persistent questions is his decision to never write a memoir. Publishers have begged. Fellow actors have encouraged. Yet Jack refuses. "Some stories die when you write them down," he says. "Some truths don't belong on paper." His walls are lined with books, philosophy, poetry, indigenous history, out-of-print novels, but none of them are his own. Still, late at night, neighbors say the light in his study stays on. The faint tapping of a typewriter can be heard. So what is he writing? And for whom? He keeps a weathered briefcase beneath his bed, one of those old-school leather ones with a brass clasp, and the initials JT barely legible. He's been seen clutching it like armor during hospital visits. Some believe it holds a manuscript. Others believe it's empty, carrying only the weight of everything he never said. Health-wise, Jack's struggles continue to deepen. His heart requires constant monitoring. His breathing has become increasingly shallow, yet he refuses to move into assisted care. "This house knows me," he insists, "and I know where all its ghosts hide." There's a defiance in his decision, but also something softer, something like surrender. Not to death, but to the life he's lived, complex, fractured, unfinished. He speaks less now, not because he has less to say, but because he understands that silence often holds more power than answers. When a young journalist recently asked him, "What do you think people will remember most about you?" Jack paused for a long while. Then he smiled, gently, and said, "Hopefully not the parts they understand too quickly." And with that, he stood up slowly, the click of his walking stick echoing through the quiet, and disappeared into the house. Not into the locked room, not into the study, but into that narrow hallway lined with unseen photographs, untold stories, and footsteps that only he could hear. And somewhere, deep in that quiet, something remains unwritten. Still waiting, still listening. The sound of dust and distant thunder. In the late hours of the afternoon, when the sun begins to dip behind the trees and casts long, golden fingers across the worn timber floors of his home, Jack sometimes hums. Not a tune you'd recognize. Something wordless, ancient. Like a song half-remembered from a dream, or a lullaby never sung aloud. He'll be seated in his favorite chair, cane-backed, slightly uneven, his fingers gently tracing the rim of a chipped teacup, eyes fixed on nothing. Or perhaps on something only he can see. There are notes pinned above his desk, scrawled in rough handwriting, some faded to near invisibility. One reads, "Do not tell them everything. Let them sit with the spaces between." Another says simply, "Find Eliza." Below it, a line is scratched out violently, as if erased in a moment of regret, or perhaps restraint. In the corner of the room, an old projector sits gathering dust. No one has seen it switched on in years, yet the reel remains loaded. One neighbor swears he saw flickering light through the blinds weeks ago, like a forgotten film playing to an invisible audience. Another claims she heard laughter. Jack's, but younger, unburdened. These stories drift through the town like smoke from an unseen fire. No one confronts him. No one asks. The myth of Jack is now too tightly wound with the man himself. Outside, the garden grows wild. Vines curl like secrets around the rusted gate. Birds come and go, building nests in places Jack refuses to trim back. "They remember," he once whispered, as if the wind and the wattlebirds held knowledge passed from one life to the next. He believes, in that quiet, unspeaking way, that everything leaves an imprint, especially what remains unsaid. Letters still arrive, some from fans, some from old colleagues, a few from names no one can trace. He opens them slowly, carefully, as if each one contains a sliver of a life he once brushed against and forgot, or tried to. Some he answers. Most he tucks away in a drawer that doesn't quite close. Billy visited last month. They sat on the porch for hours without speaking, just watching the sun bleed out across the sky, sharing the kind of silence that either wounds or heals, no one knows which. When Billy stood to leave, Jack held his arm just a moment longer than expected. No words, just pressure, just presence. There's talk of a documentary, a retrospective, a festival honoring his work. Jack hasn't confirmed his attendance. His publicist, long retired but still loyal, says he'll come if the wind tells him to. No one laughs at that anymore. And still, the locked room waits. Still, the typewriter clicks some nights, faint and irregular, like an old clock counting something other than time. The briefcase stays beneath the bed. The projector stays loaded. The name Eliza remains unspoken. At twilight, he often walks to the back fence, rests his hands on the worn timber, and looks out at the trees. Sometimes he says nothing. Sometimes, just barely audible, he murmurs a line. Not all stories are meant to end. Then he turns, slowly, fading into the amber shadows of the house behind him, where the dust keeps settling, the air holds its breath, and the silence speaks in riddles only he understands. And somewhere inside, the reel keeps turning.